Thank you, Dr. Gunn, for your inspiring remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, the degrees will now be conferred. Will the candidates for the degrees of Juris Doctor and the Master of Science degrees in Education Law, Employment Law, and Health Law please rise? President Hanbury, on the recommendation of the faculty of the Shepard Broad Law Center, I am pleased to present the candidates for the degrees of Juris Doctor and Master of Science. I ask you to confer upon them the degree which they have earned. Thank you. You may all take your seat until requested to come forward. Will the candidates for the Master of Science degree in Education Law, Employment Law, and Health Law please rise? I also ask President Hanbury, Dean Langan, Barry Bassell, Janet Morseray, David Tyree to come forward to congratulate the graduates.
Wendy Michelle West. Jessica Latavia Kendrick. Melissa Fernandez. Vincina Paulina. Nancy Aldane. Elizabeth Ann Holfeld. Deborah Bowman. Sheila Ann Millard. Tony Gamble. Teresa McCarthy. Melissa Prochaska Wiggum. Kevin Eric Johnson. Cheryl Joy Domenico. Milbrook Pedor. Veronica Perez Gurry. Angela Britton Gehrig. Ruby Geetha Kantaraja. Deborah Denise Jenkins. Kristen Renee Barber. Dorothy Siemens.
Will the candidates for the degree of Juris Doctor please rise and come forward when requested to be hooded? I would also like to request the hooding committee of Judge Robert Diaz, Jamie Finzio Bascom, and the faculty hooders to please come forward.
Chris Scott Dutton, being hooded by Judge Orlando. Jelena Agulo, being hooded by Judge Art Capaccio. Linda T. Fresneda, being hooded by Professor Perez. Karen Judith Mena, being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. Laura B. Garcia, being hooded by Professor Perez. Anthony Abiuso, Jr., being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. Kevin Michael Conchel, being hooded by Professor Perez. Gina Renee Messina, being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. Teresita Maria Rodriguez, being hooded by Professor Profiter. Jessica Cherry, being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. Rainier Riguero, being hooded by Professor Roque. Carlos Alberto Prieto, being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. Amanda Michelle Levine, being hooded by Professor Michael Richmond. Michael Arthur Sharp, being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. Stratton Smiling, being hooded by Professor Michael Richmond. Jennifer Ashley Gaviria, being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. Meredith Jane Story, being hooded by Professor Michael Richmond. Elizabeth A. Rodriguez, being hooded by Professor Arcabacio. David Andrew Fry, Jr., being hooded by Professor Mitch Silverman. Shira Patel, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Danielle Page Gruber, being hooded by Professor Mitch Silverman. Ruby Garg, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Matthew I. Botkin, being hooded by Professor Mitch Silverman. Leilani Sorgan, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Lisa Sammy Kass, being hooded by Professor Struffolino. Danielle Melanie Kay, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Gabriela Castillo, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Melissa R. Rojas, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Lear Dahlia Gloger, being hooded by Professor Stroffolino. Charlene Thorpe, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Suzette Renaud Ritchie, being hooded by Professor Tatunik. Miriam Rosenblatt, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Emily Ruth Josephson, being hooded by Professor Tatunik. Alfonso Jose Borgen, being hooded by Professor Acaro. Ashley Nicole Scala, being hooded by Professor Tatunik. Barry Edward Chinman, being hooded by Professor Baxter. Quentin Lerner Weisberg, being hooded by Professor Baxter. Megan Faye Bridwell, being hooded by Professor Ustavenes. Tara Wood, being hooded by Professor Blackwelder. Lauren Ashley Capneff, being hooded by Professor Weber. Maybelle Castabon, being hooded by Professor Blackwelder. Monica Elizabeth Jordan, being hooded by Professor Weber. Melissa Falcone, being hooded by Professor Blackwelder. Dominique Vanette Sinopoulos, being hooded by Professor Weber. Julie Collonge, being hooded by Professor Blackwelder. Shara Lynn Bishop, being hooded by Professor Weber. Rosemary Marchese, being hooded by Professor Blackwelder. Lisette Mediavilla, being hooded by Professor Weber. Alanette Equesta Opena, being hooded by Professor Canova. Eric Spreckman, being hooded by Professor Weber. Yazin Kamal Didez, being hooded by Professor Canova. Ryan William LaPella, being hooded by Professor Weber. Matthew Zukowski, being hooded by Professor Canova. Richard William Cornelius Jr., being hooded by Professor Weber. Kendra Shantia Breeden, being hooded by Professor Cassidy. Sean Greg McCloskey, being hooded by Professor Weber. Michelle Avis, being hooded by Professor Cassidy. Ricky Danielle Frand, being hooded by Professor Willits. Camilla Daza, being hooded by Professor Cassidy. Bradley Foster, being hooded by Professor Seminara. Jonathan Hendricks, being hooded by Professor Williams. Melissa Aponte Martini, being hooded by Professor Seminara. Miguel Coder, being hooded by Professor Wazatsky. Tasha Maria de Miguel, being hooded by Professor Sermonara. Siri Canavan, being hooded by Professor Young. Elizabeth Estrada, being hooded by Professor Sermonara. Carl J. Domino. Hooded by Professor Fenicio. Ilan Newman, being hooded by Professor Sermonara. Evan Miles Goldberg, being hooded by Professor Fenicio. Ashley Dixon Ralston, being hooded by Professor Cheney. Stephen Willard Domrick, being hooded by Board of Governor Professor Fenicio. Sebastian Larea, being hooded by Professor Cheney. Spencer Kaiser, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Carrie Shapiro, being hooded by Professor Cheney. Robert Louis Newman, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Daniel Lewin, being hooded by Professor Cheney. Henry Jesse Brewer III, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Anya Roth, being hooded by Professor Cheney. George Oyana, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Erica M. Martinez, being hooded by Professor Cheney. Michael Francis Nahabidian, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Yane Mia Brauso, being hooded by Professor Coleman. Jennifer Matthews Valley, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Tricia Branker, being hooded by Professor Coleman. Adnan Shad Kansur, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Marissa Charlotte Furman, being hooded by Professor Coleman. Juris Storen, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Alvaro Augusto Acevedo, being hooded by Professor Coleman. Natasha Sheikh, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Chelsea Elizabeth Hunter, being hooded by Professor Cooney. Samantha Beth Seltzer, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Jason Thomasy, being hooded by Professor Cooney. Anthony Joseph Badway, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Adam Jesse Tanner, being hooded by Professor Cooney. Marta Garcia, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Mani Sarah Havanich, being hooded by Professor Cooney. Ariel Rachel Ennisman, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Lauren Taylor Clifton, being hooded by Professor Curtis. Teresa Nguyen, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Diana Geraldo, being hooded by Professor Curtis. Christine Nicole Turner, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Jamie Lynn Day, being hooded by Professor Curtis. Emmy Vanio, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Syra Kushid, being hooded by Professor Curtis. Nicole Marie Dambra, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Fernanda Torres, being hooded by Professor Curtis. Jeffrey Blake Virchow, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Jill Lauren Aberback, being hooded by Professor Curtis. Vincent Maresca, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Lydia Bargueo Harley, being hooded by Professor Dell. Daniel Drazen, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Julia Ann Sturgill, being hooded by Professor Dell. Brielle Courtney Baffert, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Ellie Einhorn, being hooded by Professor Dell. David Speckler, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Arlen Mason Weintraub, being hooded by Professor Dowse. David DiNatella, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. John Andrew Talley, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Jake Aaron Tover, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Vanessa Ann Sablano, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Christopher Edward Hewitt, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Annalise Hayes, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Kelly Finneran Lago, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Jessica A. Bartell, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Evan Michael Cohn, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. H. Seth Rosenthal, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Sarah Maria Piscatelli, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Andre Cadiletz, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Jay Dermer, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Herbert Lawrence Uzzi, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Matthew Brian Wasserman, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Natalie Michelle Vasquez, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Angela Elaine Gerlach, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Anna Valero Tiano, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Justin E. Zeig, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Lindsay Ann Wright Manella, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Mark Sargent, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Anastasia Jean Mahoney, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Zishan Mumtaz, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Alex Lee, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Shira Hafiz, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Brian Eric Taft, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Alana Ariel Weinstein, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Iris Kwan, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Christina Cassie, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Amara Eldahar, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Joseph Michael Williams, being hooded by Professor Dobson. Jordan Garrett Winkle, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Riza C. Vargas, being hooded by Professor Duhart. Evan Scott Gusky, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Stefania Bertoni, being hooded by Professor Duhart. Levy Daniel Thomas, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Tal Harari, being hooded by Professor Duhart. Corey James Vincent, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Colby Aaron Grossman, being hooded by Professor Duhart. Alexander Ostrovsky, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Joseph Matthew Morjazy, being hooded by Professor Duhart. Christian Francis Prescott LaClanche, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Clifford Joseph Johnson, being hooded by Professor Duhart. Samantha Jane Seidler, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Erica Ashley Case, being hooded by Professor Duhart. Julian Hernandez, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. J. Samuel London, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Ryan Creda, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Robert Alexander Spotswood, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Christina Aida Sivia, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Charles Larkin Scott, Jr., being hooded by Professor Flynn. Sharita Renee Young, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Courtney Sarah Milam, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Jonathan Michael Richmond, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Mariter Taveras, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Ryan Patrick McGlynn, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Blake Andrew Levine, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Eric T. Highland, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Travis J. Roddick, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Kevin Michael Carbon, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Jenna Kate Appledorf, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Christine Justman, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Randall Albert Diaz, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Alicia Marie Robertson, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Matthew Ryan Gelber, being hooded by Professor Flynn. Davika Lynn Carr, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. David A. Yurgi, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Nicole Marcel Baghdadi, being hooded by Professor Foster. Lisa Janice Johnson, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Chelsea Rose Ewart, being hooded by Professor Foster. Sarah Elizabeth Gellerman, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Morgan Rachel Wells, being hooded by Professor Foster. Victoria Marie Pereira, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Lisa Danielle Gotkin, being hooded by Professor Glussman. Gregory Michael Friend, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Kimberly Lauren Wald, being hooded by Professor Glussman. Kristen Ann Souls, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Amir Cyrus, being hooded by Professor Glussman. Christabel Santana, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Lindsay Zielinski, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Derek Christian Morales, being hooded by Professor Glussman. Catherine Higgins, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Christine Keller, being hooded by Professor Goldberg. Adam Peterson, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Augusto Pereira, being hooded by Professor Grosso. Ilana Friedman, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Lizette Romero, being hooded by Professor Grosso. Rosalie Margaret Walker Dixon, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Isidoro Rafael Lopez, being hooded by Professor Grosso. Jordan D. Utansky, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Lisa Ann Reyes, being hooded by Professor Grosso. Diana Herrera Rocha, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Reynaldo Daniel Diaz, being hooded by Professor Grosso. Rafael Caraballo Vasquez, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Ryan Alexander Abrams, being hooded by Professor Grosso. Erica Alberino, being hooded by Board of Governor Jamie Fenicio. Fabio Jalanza, being hooded by Professor Harbaugh. Suzanne Heather Bloom, being hooded by her sister, Amy Bloom, class of 2012. Catherine Eva Kulik, being hooded by Professor Harbaugh. Jordan Mark Greenberg, being hooded by his brother, Jared Paul Greenberg, class of 2009. Sherilyn Corey, being hooded by Professor Harbaugh. Jesse Taylor Schwartz, being hooded by his father, Jay Schwartz, charter class member 1974. One Kim Tron, being hooded by Professor Harbaugh. Kristen Lauren Palacio, being hooded by her father, Ramon Palacio, class of 1999. Brandon Scott Labinier, being hooded by Professor Nolka. Corey D. Lapin, being hooded by his brother Aaron Lapin, class of 2010. Luz D. Nieto, being hooded by Professor Nalka. Billy Lee Brock, being hooded by Professor Hartzell. Jonathan Alvarez, being hooded by Professor Nalka. Melanie Mabel Dunkill, being hooded by her husband Andrew Dunkill, class of 2012. George Troutman, being hooded by Professor Nalka. Sylvia Amanda Cobo, being hooded by Paul Salognolo, Board of Trustees. Christopher Aaron McClintock, being hooded by Professor Kundawala. Zachary Ryan Davis, being hooded by his father, Michael Davis, class of 1981. Zilvanus Mardosas, being hooded by Professor Kundawala. Caroline Tabash, being hooded by Professor Kundawala. Santino Fenicio, being hooded by Board of Governor, Mr. Fenicio. Jessica Antorinian, being hooded by Professor Kundawala. Mark John Fenicio, being hooded by Board of Governors, Mr. Fenicio. Kiran Garcia, being hooded by Professor Kundawala. Sam R. Solomon, being hooded by his mother, Wendy Solomon, class of 1981. Christina P. Lim, being hooded by Professor Kundawala. Natasha Chupiga, being hooded by Professor Kundawala. Shasha Terranova, being hooded by Judge Diaz. Ariel Elise Bishop, being hooded by Judge Diaz. Tibet Shakur Tony Wanri, being hooded by Professor Lewis. Brianna Lynn Jones, being hooded by Dean Langan. Suzette Laurent, being hooded by Professor Lewis. Emily Lauren Pineless, being hooded by Dean Langan. Kimberly Ann Madajizek, being hooded by Professor Mesenter. Christine Espina, being hooded by Dean Langan. Lourdes Domingo Montecon, being hooded by Professor Marty Nelson. Shitra Rajesh, being hooded by Judge Maltak. Miriam Schlesinger, being hooded by Professor Marty Nelson. Jacqueline Zacharias, being hooded by Judge Maltek. Eli Pollock, being hooded by Professor Marty Nelson. Laura Danielle Petruzak, being hooded by Professor Marty Nelson. Mike Leonard, being hooded by Professor Moore. Julie Taylor Drake, being hooded by Professor Marty Nelson. Jennifer Aguila, being hooded by Professor Mara. Michelle Nichols DeLong, being hooded by Professor Marty Nelson. Jennifer Jaime, being hooded by Professor Mara. Elizabeth Teresa Ann Cotta, being hooded by Professor Morton.
Now, will all of the graduates please rise? Okay, it's not over yet. This is the big part. By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees of Nova Southeastern University, I hereby confer upon you the degree Master of Science and Juris Doctorate. With all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities pertaining hereto. Congratulations to all of you. Please be seated.
Okay, I know this seems like the never-ending commencement ceremony, but I have just a few more words, and actually these are directed towards the graduates, family, and friends. For the next 11 weeks, those of your family members who just earned their JD degrees will be on one additional journey, and that is studying for the bar exam. Some people are actually excited about that, apparently. I ask you, the family members and friends of our graduates, to please help them on that journey. It will be a difficult journey, but we know with your help, they will successfully pass the bar exam, and we will do our best here, especially through our Florida Bar Auxiliary Program, to make sure that all of today's graduates, come September, will be members of the Florida Bar. Congratulations to all of you.
I think everyone will agree that it takes many dedicated people to make an event like this come off and to be acknowledged. I'd like to acknowledge Jamie Ellen de Oliveira for singing the Star Spangled Banner. She did a beautiful job. She will also be singing the NSU anthem. Davy Tyree, who called out every name and didn't miss a beat as to who was going to get it, calling out all of the names of the graduates. Thank David for that. And then obviously Dr. Mark Kavanaugh and the entire orchestra for all of what they've done before and doing and after. And then Elaine Poff has been orchestrating the entire event, seeing that you got in the right row with all the marshals in the white shirts. Let's recognize them. And then finally, before I call Dr. Flores, I would like for everybody in the audience to stand and for the graduates to thank everybody who came, from faculty, staff, parents, loved ones, and oh, it's up to you.
Please sit down. Please sit down. And now you will rise again and remain standing at your seats during the singing of the university anthem. Please all stand up.
Radiant star of our morning,
standing until the platform party, the faculty, and the graduates have left the hall. I now declare that this 38th annual Nova Southeastern University Law Center ceremony to be closed.